with two broad categories, and they are quite broad. We have the longbow and we have the flatbow. And most people would think the real distinction would be length, hence the name longbow. It's much more to do with the cross section, however. So if we look at a longbow, and this is a recreation of an artillery bow, almost as deep as it is wide, whereas a flatbow is much wider than it is deep. Part of the process of making a bow is to design something that will store energy and then allow that energy to impart to the arrow. Now, it makes sense that a short piece of wood will only bend so far before it breaks. So our ancestors, our bow makers, made their bows much, much taller so that they could bend back further with a longer arrow storing more energy. And you can see this one's upwards of 6'6". Some of the Mary Rose bows are close to 7 foot. If you increase the length of the bow, you increase the mass of the bow. And then the bow has to move its own limbs forward and uses energy to do that. And obviously then some of that energy won't be available to the arrow. So what happened, I think, in the 30s was some Americans got together and came up with something that was quite similar to this. It's not quite the same, but the American longbow, which is broad across its entire working section and then narrowed down to lighten those tips, make them as light as possible, and effectively turn them into levers, just extending the length of the bow, allowing that wood to bend without breaking. And then I think in the 50s, in Holmgard, which is a little island off Denmark, as I understand it, archaeologists dug up something very similar to this, which is the Holmgard bow, made all those years ago by our ancestors that understood this technology of making the broad working part of the limb do most of the work, that's storing most of the energy. The tips, or the last 8 to 10 inches of a bow, they think now only store about 7% of the energy, so it makes sense to make those as light and as stiff as possible, non-bending, and just allow them to extend the length of the bow to allow that wood to be bent without breaking. And they realised our ancestors had been doing this 9,000 years ago. If we have weak or low density timbers, the rule of thumb is to make them wider to spread these compression forces, or longer, or both. This one is a paddled style bow. You can see, although we've got a lot of strength here because we've not narrowed until this very, very tiny bit right at the end, it's not likely to be as efficient as this because it's got more mass to move. However, it's a lot less likely to break because it's got a lot of support across the bits that are getting subject to compression and tension. The Rotten Bottom bow, found in Rotten Bottom in Scotland, was this exact longbow profile, but obviously a lot smaller, a lot narrower, and more of a hunting weight, which we can recreate. Yew has always been the sort of favoured bow wood. It can stand being put into a very narrow cross section without breaking, and it's also very, very elastic. It's actually quite difficult to come by these days. What lots of bow makers do now is they will laminate woods to recreate what we have here, which is the union between the heartwood, which is this lovely golden colour, and this whiter coloured sapwood. The principle being, if you imagine that this flexes in the wind and stretches, which is exactly how it would happen when it was shooting, and then the more golden coloured heartwood gets compressed. And that's what we recreate when we make a bow. As we pull down on this, you can see the sapwood stretches and the heartwood compresses. Oftentimes we've got to deal with something like this, which is all the bumps and lumps and dips. The heartwood has to dip in, otherwise you end up with a stiff spot and it won't bend evenly, because what we're after is a lovely bend throughout the whole arc of the bow. And this becomes quite complicated. We're going to go over and stick a couple of these guys on the tillering jig there and show you some shapes. What we have when we bend a piece of wood, and this is exactly what we're going to do with a bow, we have the outside here, which is under tension, and the underside here, which is in compression, and then somewhere in between we have this, what they call the neutral axis, which is in neither tension or compression, or both. I can't quite work that out. It's very mathematical. I'm not very mathematical, I'm afraid. Essentially, if we're going to change the bend of this curve, we kind of leave wood alone where it bends too much, and we take wood off where it doesn't bend enough. And all the time we're removing wood, we're shifting the position of that neutral axis, which is why warming up, stretching those fibres is critical. We have so many bows fail because people try and do this process too quickly. If we look at a home guard bow, which I'll put on the tiller in a moment, this bit should bend, and then pretty much from here nothing should happen. These should just be these stiff levers that we talked about. And you can see here that this one already starts to arc out, and this one doesn't. And this again isn't bad workmanship. This was in the wood. This flicked out in the stave or the log that this was made from, and has always been there. So I'm going to put this on and we can see that shape hopefully. It's very, very stiff at the ends and then moving hopefully reasonably even right up to this point. And traditionally longbows, the handles were offset. The rationale being that if you made the arrow pass close to the centre of the bow, then you'd have to drop your hand down slightly and make this limb shorter than this limb, as you can probably see from there. So when we pull this back on the jig, this should perform a very, very smooth arc right from here all the way down, and then still, like all these other designs, even our medieval bowyers knew this, the tip shouldn't bend very much at all, because we just want those to be levers. So it should be quite stiff from that point, and it should match on this side, except this limb will appear shorter and stiffer than this one, because it is. So if I put that one in, now this is stiffened through the handle, and the medieval bows bent through the handle, and this was all part of this process of being able to pull them further back, and under greater force you had more wood working. So we can see here we've got a slightly flattened centre section before it arcs over again to those stiff tips at the end, and that's in pretty good tiller, I'd say, for that style of bow. This is the heart to the bow making process. It's not the carpentry that gets you the shape, it's the training the wood to bend and correcting all the little imperfections in the curve that make it.